In the summer of 1957, Marilyn Monroe stood in front of a mirror in her New York apartment, holding a small white dress. It wasn't for her, it was for a child she had already lost. This wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last. Marilyn Monroe is remembered for many things: her beauty, her voice, the way she moved on screen. But there is a part of her story that is rarely told, a part she kept hidden behind the lights and the laughter. It is the story of a woman who wanted nothing more than to be a mother, and a world that ensured she never could be. This is not about scandal, nor about rumors or conspiracy theories. It is about something quieter and more human. It is about loss, longing, and the invisible pressure placed on women's bodies, especially when those women belong to the public. Marilyn Monroe experienced at least 3 documented miscarriages during her lifetime, and some sources suggest there may have been more. She spoke about them rarely and only to those closest to her. In a society that did not openly discuss such things, her grief was expected to remain private. Yet in her journals, letters to friends, and the few interviews where she lowered her guard, a different picture emerges. A woman who desperately wanted to be a mother and who believed deep down that she had failed. Her first known pregnancy ended in 1957 during her marriage to playwright Arthur Miller. She had been filming The Prince and the Showgirl in London the year before, and the marriage was still new. When she discovered she was pregnant, friends later recalled, she was overjoyed. She saw it as a chance to build the family she had never had growing up. But weeks later, she miscarried, and the loss devastated her. Arthur Miller later wrote about this period with careful distance. He described Marilyn's sadness as something vast and unreachable. She withdrew, stopped sleeping, and began taking more pills, barbiturates prescribed by doctors who did not ask too many questions. This was not just grief. It was the beginning of a pattern that would repeat itself until the end of her life. Her second pregnancy came in 1958. By then, Marilyn and Arthur were living in a rented home in Connecticut, attempting to escape Hollywood's noise. She wanted quiet, normalcy, and the chance to be a wife and a mother rather than a movie star. For a brief time, it seemed possible, but in August of that year, she lost the baby again. Doctors called it an ectopic pregnancy, a dangerous condition in which the embryo implants outside the uterus. For Marilyn, it felt like a final verdict. She was admitted to a hospital in New York where the necessary procedure left her feeling empty in every sense. Friends who visited her said she seemed distant, as if watching her own life from the outside. She smiled when people arrived, asked about their children and their lives. But when they left, the smile disappeared. There was a third pregnancy in 1960 during the filming of The Misfits. By then, her marriage to Miller was unraveling. The set was tense, the desert heat oppressive, and Marilyn was struggling physically and emotionally. She relied on sedatives to sleep and stimulants to stay awake. When she became pregnant again, those close to her were cautiously hopeful, but the pregnancy did not last. She miscarried once more in a Los Angeles hospital. Doctors told her body could not carry a child to term. She was 34 years old, and she felt her time had run out. It is easy to see these events as a series of medical tragedies, and they were. But they were also part of something larger, a story about what it meant to be a woman in Hollywood during the 1950s and early 1960s, where women's bodies were controlled, judged, and commodified in ways men's bodies never were. Marilyn's studio contracts were strict, containing clauses about weight, appearance, and availability. Pregnancy was often treated as a breach of contract. It meant delays, publicity problems, and the risk of cracking the carefully constructed image of a sex symbol. The studios wanted Marilyn Monroe the fantasy, not Marilyn Monroe the mother. She understood this. In private conversations, she expressed frustration with how she was perceived. She wanted to be taken seriously as an actress. She studied at the Actors Studio under Lee Strasberg, read psychology and philosophy, and worked relentlessly to prove that there was more to her than blonde hair and a breathless voice. But every time she pushed back against the image, the industry pushed harder. And when her body failed to give her the one thing that felt entirely hers, a child, it felt like the final betrayal. There's also the question of medical care. Marilyn saw many doctors over the years. Some were reputable, others were not. She was prescribed barbiturates, amphetamines, and painkillers with alarming frequency. These medications were common at the time, especially among people in high-stress professions. But they had consequences. They affected sleep, they affected mood, and they affected fertility. Some medical experts who have reviewed her case in retrospect suggest that the combination of stress, substance use, and possible underlying health issues such as endometriosis could have made it nearly impossible for her to sustain a pregnancy. But in the 1950s, these conversations didn't happen. Women were expected to bear children without complaint. If they couldn't, it was seen as a personal failure, not a systemic or medical one. Marilyn internalized that failure. She blamed herself. In her journals, she wrote about feeling broken, about feeling like she wasn't a real woman. She wrote about seeing other women with their children and feeling a kind of emptiness that nothing else, not fame, not money, not applause, could fill. Her third husband, Arthur Miller, later reflected on this period with a kind of distant sadness. He admitted that he didn't fully understand what she was going through. He was focused on his work, on his plays, on his own internal struggles. And Marilyn, for all her visibility, was often alone with her pain. But she wasn't entirely silent. In a 1962 interview just months before her death, Marilyn spoke briefly about wanting children. She said it was the thing she regretted most in life. She said she would have given up everything for it. The interviewer moved on quickly. It wasn't the kind of quote that sold magazines, but it was perhaps the most honest thing she ever said publicly. It's worth considering what motherhood represented to Marilyn. She didn't grow up with a stable family. Her mother, Gladys, struggled with mental illness and was unable to care for her. Marilyn spent much of her childhood in foster homes and an orphanage. She was passed between families, never quite belonging anywhere. The idea of having her own child wasn't just about biology. It was about creating the family she never had. It was about giving someone else the childhood she was denied. That longing shows up again and again in the way she interacted with children. There are photographs of her on film sets, sitting with child actors, laughing genuinely. There are stories of her visiting hospitals and orphanages, spending hours with kids when there were no cameras around. She didn't do it for publicity. She did it because in those moments she could imagine a different version of her life. But that version never came. And as the miscarriages accumulated, so did the sense that something fundamental had been taken from her. Not just by chance, not just by bad luck, but by a system that needed her to be one thing and one thing only. A symbol, not a person. The public didn't know most of this while she was alive. The studios controlled the narrative. The press printed what they were told to print. Marilyn smiled for the cameras and played the role she was given. But in private, she was falling apart. The miscarriages were part of it. The pills were part of it. The loneliness was part of it. And the pressure, constant, suffocating, inescapable, was always there. By 1962, Marilyn's life had become almost unrecognizable. Her marriage to Miller had ended in divorce. Her contract with 20th Century Fox was in jeopardy after she was fired from the film Something's Got to Give for repeated absences. She was isolated, she was struggling, and she was still grieving the children she never had. There are those who argue that her inability to have children contributed to her decline, that the repeated losses combined with everything else she was dealing with became too much to bear. It's impossible to say for certain, but what is certain is that Marilyn Monroe wanted to be a mother, and the world she lived in made that dream almost impossible to realize. Her story raises uncomfortable questions. Questions about how society treats women's bodies, about how fame can become a prison, about how grief, when it's not allowed to be spoken, can consume a person from the inside out. Marilyn Monroe gave the world so much. But the one thing she wanted most, the thing that had nothing to do with movies or fame or beauty, was something she could never have. In the decades since her death, the conversation around miscarriage, fertility, and women's health has changed. Slowly, painfully, but it has changed. Women speak more openly now about their losses, about their struggles, about the pressure they feel to conceive, to carry, to give birth. Marilyn didn't have that language. She didn't have that support. She carried it alone. And maybe that's the real tragedy. Not just the miscarriages themselves, but the silence around them. The expectation that she should keep smiling, keep working, keep being Marilyn Monroe, even when the person behind that name was breaking. There's a photograph from 1961. Marilyn is sitting in a park, watching a mother with a stroller. The mother doesn't notice her. Marilyn isn't posing, she isn't performing, she's just watching. And on her face, there's an expression that's hard to describe. It's not quite sadness, it's not quite longing. It's something deeper, something quieter. It's the look of someone who knows exactly what they've lost. That image stays with you because it's a reminder that Marilyn Monroe wasn't just a star. She was a woman who wanted ordinary things, a woman who dreamed of a life beyond the spotlight, a woman who, in the end, never got to live it. Her story doesn't have a neat ending. There's no resolution, no closure. Just the weight of what was lost and the memory of a woman who carried more than the world ever knew. And maybe that's what we owe her now. Not pity, not romanticization, but recognition. Recognition of the full human being behind the image. The one who wanted to be a mother. The one who never got the chance. Marilyn Monroe died on August 5th, 1962. She was 36 years old. In the years since, countless books, films, and documentaries have tried to explain who she was and what happened to her. But very few have focused on this part of her life. The part that she kept hidden. The part that mattered most to her, because in the end, Marilyn Monroe wasn't just a symbol of beauty or desire or tragedy. She was a woman who wanted to hold her own child, who wanted to hear the word mama, who wanted to build a family in a world that had never given her one. And that loss, quiet, invisible, unspoken, was perhaps the deepest wound of all. But the story doesn't end with her death. It continues in the lives of women who came after her, women who faced similar struggles, women who also wanted to be mothers and couldn't, women whose grief was dismissed or ignored because society didn't know how to talk about it. In the years immediately following Marilyn's death, Hollywood continued as if nothing had changed. Actresses were still expected to maintain impossible standards. Pregnancy was still seen as a career liability, and miscarriage was still something women endured in private, without acknowledgement or support. It would take decades before the conversation began to shift. Before women started speaking publicly about pregnancy loss, before medical professionals began to take these experiences seriously, and even today the stigma hasn't entirely disappeared. Women are still blamed for their bodies' failures, still told they're not trying hard enough, still made to feel that their worth is tied to their ability to reproduce. Marilyn's story is a reminder of how far we've come, but also of how far we still have to go. Consider the medical realities she faced. In the 1950s and early 1960s, reproductive medicine was still in its infancy. There were no fertility clinics, no IVF, no comprehensive prenatal care designed to identify and address complications early. Women who experienced recurrent miscarriages had few options and even fewer answers. Doctors at the time often attributed miscarriages to stress, emotional instability, or a woman's inability to properly manage her life. The medical establishment was quick to pathologize women's bodies while offering little in terms of actual treatment or support. Marilyn was told more than once that her lifestyle was to blame, that if she rested more, worried less, took better care of herself, things might be different. But the truth was more complex. Her endometriosis, if that was indeed what she suffered from, was a legitimate medical condition that could have been managed with proper care. The medications she was prescribed, barbiturates, amphetamines, sedatives, were known to interfere with fertility, but her doctors continued prescribing them anyway. The very people who were supposed to help her were, in some ways, making things worse. And then there was the psychological toll. Each miscarriage wasn't just a physical loss. It was a confirmation of her deepest fear that she was fundamentally broken, that the damage done in her childhood, the neglect, the abuse, the instability, had left permanent scars that no amount of success could heal. She wrote about this in her journals, about feeling like damaged goods, about wondering if her mother's mental illness had been passed down to her in some way, about fearing that even if she had managed to carry a child to term, she wouldn't have been a good mother. These fears were unfounded. People who knew her well, who saw how she interacted with children, insisted that she would have been a wonderful mother. She was patient. She was kind. She had an instinct for making children feel seen and valued. But Marilyn couldn't see that in herself. She only saw the failures. There's a story that Norman Roston, a poet and close friend of Marilyn's, later recounted. In 1960, he and his wife invited Marilyn to their home for dinner. Their young daughter Patricia was there. Marilyn spent most of the evening on the floor with Patricia, playing games, reading stories, making the child laugh. When it was time to leave, Patricia asked if Marilyn could come back. And Marilyn, according to Roston, had tears in her eyes. She said yes, of course she would come back. But there was something in her voice that suggested she knew she wouldn't. Roston later wrote that he realized in that moment how much pain Marilyn carried, how much she longed for something she couldn't have, and how deeply unfair it was that a woman with so much love to give had no one to give it to. In her final year, Marilyn's desperation became more visible. She talked openly with friends about adoption. She researched agencies. She filled out forms. She even consulted lawyers about what it would take for a single woman in her position to adopt a child. The answer, unfortunately, was that it would be extremely difficult. Adoption agencies in the early 1960s prioritized married couples. Single women, especially those with unstable work schedules and public reputations, were seen as high-risk placements. Marilyn's divorces, her history of psychiatric treatment, her well-documented struggles with pills, all of it worked against her. But she didn't give up. She told friends that if she couldn't adopt in the United States, she would look internationally. She mentioned Mexico. She mentioned orphanages she had read about in Europe. She was willing to go anywhere, do anything to become a mother. One friend, who asked to remain anonymous in later interviews, recalled a conversation with Marilyn just months before her death. Marilyn had said that she was done with Hollywood, that she was thinking about moving away, maybe to New York permanently, maybe somewhere quieter. She wanted to adopt a child and raise them away from the cameras, away from the noise, away from Marilyn Monroe. When her friend asked if she was serious, Marilyn said yes. More serious than she had ever been about anything. She said that if she died without having been someone's mother, her entire life would have been a waste. Those words are haunting in retrospect, because less than 3 months later she was gone. The circumstances of her death have been analyzed endlessly. The toxicology reports, the timeline, the people who saw her last. But what often gets lost in those discussions is the emotional state she was in. Not just on the night she died, but in the months and years leading up to it. She was grieving, not just for the children she had lost, but for the life she had imagined and never lived. For the version of herself that would have been a mother, a wife, a woman with a family and a home and a purpose beyond fame. That grief was compounded by the isolation she felt, by the sense that no one truly understood what she was going through. Even her closest friends admitted later that they didn't fully grasp the depth of her pain. They saw her sadness. They knew about the miscarriages. But they didn't realize how much those losses had broken her, how much she had staked her sense of self-worth on the idea of becoming a mother, and how devastating it was when that possibility was taken away. In the days after her death, reporters focused on the pills, on the possible affairs, on the mysteries and conspiracies. But almost no one talked about the fact that Marilyn Monroe had died childless, that she had spent her final years mourning children who never existed, that her greatest dream had been the one thing she couldn't achieve. It took years before that part of her story began to emerge, before biographers started paying attention to her journals, to the letters she had written, to the conversations her friends had preserved. And even then, it was often framed as a footnote. a sad detail, not the central tragedy that it actually was. But for Marilyn, it was everything. It shaped how she saw herself. It influenced her relationships. It contributed to the depression and anxiety that plagued her final years. And it's impossible to fully understand who she was without acknowledging how much she wanted to be a mother and how deeply it hurt that she never became one. In the decades since her death, attitudes toward miscarriage and infertility have evolved. There are support groups now, therapists who specialize in pregnancy loss, online communities where women can share their experiences without shame. Medical advancements have made it possible for many women who struggle with fertility to still become mothers. But even with all that progress, the stigma hasn't entirely disappeared. Women are still judged for how their bodies perform, still blamed when pregnancies don't go as planned, still made to feel that their value as women is tied to their ability to bear children. Marilyn Monroe's story is a stark reminder of what that pressure can do to a person, of how it can eat away at self-worth, of how it can turn what should be a private medical experience into a source of public shame. She deserved better. She deserved doctors who took her concerns seriously. She deserved a support system that acknowledged her grief. She deserved a world that didn't define her worth by her body's reproductive capacity. But she didn't get any of that, and in the end, it contributed to a life that ended far too soon. There's one more detail worth mentioning. In Marilyn's will, which was written in 1961 and revised shortly before her death, she left a portion of her estate to children's charities, specifically to organizations that supported orphaned and foster children. She wanted to help kids who were growing up the way she had, kids who didn't have families, kids who needed someone to believe in them. It's a small detail, but it speaks volumes about who she was. Even in her final days, when she was struggling with her own pain, she was thinking about children, about the ones she couldn't save, about the ones she never got to have. She couldn't be a mother, but she could, in her own way, still care for children, still make their lives a little better, still give them something she never had. And maybe that's the most fitting tribute to her memory. Not the movies, not the iconic photographs, not the legends and the myths, but the quiet, unspoken kindness of a woman who never stopped hoping, who never stopped caring, who never stopped wanting to give love, even when the world had taken so much from her. Marilyn Monroe's life was filled with contradictions. She was famous but lonely, desired but unloved, celebrated but misunderstood. And she was a woman who wanted nothing more than to be ordinary, to have a family, to be someone's mother, to belong. She never got that. And the absence of it colored everything else. It was the empty space at the center of her life, the thing that no amount of success could fill, the wound that never healed. In the end, that's what makes her story so tragic. Not the way she died, but the way she lived. Not the mysteries surrounding her final hours, but the quiet, everyday pain of wanting something so fundamental and never being able to have it. Marilyn Monroe wanted to be a mother. She wanted to hold her child. She wanted to build a family, and the world, in all its cruelty and complexity, made sure she never could. That's the story. That's the truth. And that's what we should remember when we think of her now. Not just the glamour, not just the tragedy, but the woman behind it all. The one who loved children. The one who dreamed of a different life. The one who never stopped hoping, even when hope seemed impossible. Because in the end, that's who Marilyn Monroe really was. Not a symbol, not an icon, but a woman who wanted what so many women want, and who spent her entire life searching for something she would never find.